This guy concludes his book by talking about culture wars. And you kind of grew up in the middle of what we call the culture wars. And some of this is actually a little bit before you came on the scene, but it's recent history, and it kind of dictates the landscape for discussions about religion today that you guys are going to be engaged in throughout the rest of your life, because religion is not going to go away. It's going to continue to play an important role in American life, in culture, in politics. It's going to morph into different, frameworks and focuses than we're seeing with this textbook. But it's guaranteed it's going to be around. It's going to be an important force. And when we talk about the culture wars, is this something that you guys are familiar with? It was a term that was really big in the 90s. Not so many people use it today. But have you heard about this notion of culture wars? Nobody? Yeah, see, it's probably not talked that much about. Oftentimes we frame this in terms of conservatives versus liberals. And who would we line up on both sides of this? Like if we're going to pick parties, political parties, who do we line up? Conservatives is mostly, the Republicans. Liberals, Democrats. And we have other parties, right? But they're pretty small. They don't have a very big role in American life. They can't do much in politics. Like the Constitution Party would be over here, the Green Party would be over here, but they really don't do that much. And these parties are coalitions. They bring together people belonging to a lot of groups. That's why they actually have the power that they do. And they engage in a lot of formation of opinions, as we call it, in the media, in schools. So, there's a lot of hot-button issues, that divide people, like, for example, abortion. This is one that, the Republicans and Democrats are constantly fighting about, right? What else? What are some of the other key issues that people get really hot about? Yeah?
I think one of the biggest ones today is gay rights.
Yeah. Specifically, the marriage question, right? That's the one that probably gets the most press. Who else have their hand up? Somebody else have their hand up. Yeah.
I was just going to say, like, illegal immigration.
Okay, yeah, that one is interesting. Because there's people in both parties that kind of seem to agree with each other. There is a strong nativist element still in American politics of, send them foreigners home. Even though, just about everybody's descended from an immigrant of one form or another. And nobody's been able to work out a good solution for that. What are some other,
Guns.
Gun control? Okay. Yeah.
Death penalty.
That's another big one. A lot of news lately when an execution took a long time to actually pull off. What are some of these don't involve religion quite so much, like the gun control. That tends to be about the Second Amendment. Death penalty, the religion does get involved there, but that's where you sometimes see people who are quite conservative actually being against it on religious grounds. What are some areas where religion really gets right in the middle of it, that people get worked up about, besides abortion, of course? Yeah.
Stem cell research.
Yeah, there hasn't been a lot of talk about that recently, but about 10 years ago, 5 years ago, let's not just put down stem cell. Let's put down any sort of use of human parts. When is it okay to use bits and pieces of human beings to do research, to fix things? When isn't it? That's an issue that's going to get really big during your lifetime. It's going to assume a much greater role. What about in schools? What are some of the things where, yeah?
Saying the pledge.
Okay, yeah, Pledge of Allegiance. I'm going to put stuff here, but I don't mean to say that the Democrats are for or something like that. We just ran out of room. So the Pledge of Allegiance. What else? What are other school controversies? Yeah.
Prayer in public spaces.
Say again?
Prayer in public spaces.
Oh, yeah. You know, it's good that you say public spaces because it's not just schools. People are getting all worked up now because the Supreme Court sort of reaffirmed the legitimacy of beginning governmental functions with a prayer. Yeah.
It's actually, it was okay the use of secretary prayers.
Ah.
That it's okay to invoke the name of God or Jesus Christ in prayers.
Where I was going to go with this is that this has been the case for a long time, though. There was a case back, having to do with invocations for the Senate, years and years back, where they said it's okay to begin it with a prayer because it serves some secular purpose.
There are case laws on both sides.
You're right. I don't want to get too bogged down in this. I'm bringing this up as an example of a controversial issue that came up recently. But here's one of the things where you can see the Supreme Court making a big difference. School kids, there's no possibility of doing that. They don't consider that. For adults, they consider what is the purpose that's going on. And you're right. Case law, waivers back and forth. You're not going to find a lot of super coherent logic in Supreme Court decisions about, really about anything, but especially about religion. But they do open up a wider space for this, and they have for, since the 70s, than they do for with kids. So public spaces, it's good to talk in larger terms like that. That's another school issue. School prayer, Pledge of Allegiance, yeah.
Teaching evolution.
That's huge. Teaching evolution, or, and we'll just put ... because it could be intelligent design or creation science, creationism. Are you going to teach them side by side? Or are you going to teach evolution as a theory but not established fact? There's all these different permutations on it. What textbooks are you going to use? How are you going to test this sort of stuff? That's a big issue. Sex ed education is another big issue too. What should you be teaching about sexuality? We could multiply these. One of the things that this guy wants to focus on is the development of what he calls the new religious right. And I have to say, looking at this chapter, it's a little bit unbalanced because he's mostly, cautioning about how dangerous this is. I would say the religious left is they do just as much, skewing things politically. But he's focused on that, and he's telling an interesting story, which is where did this actually come from? Is this an expression of all these other things we've been studying this semester? So that's going to bring everything to kind of a close or a knot. And he begins by talking about the Puritan strain in American religion and culture, and how eventually that comes back in. And he talks about these great awakenings, and some of the key themes that you see, over and over again in the course of these great awakenings. Some people in religious studies want to call what happened in the 1970s the Third Great Awakening in the 1980s, the rise of the religious right. So what are we actually talking about here? Here's some of the key themes, just to review. The Puritans thought that earthly society is founded on divine law, that you need to have some sort of religious basis, and then secular society and secular law would not necessarily come directly from that, but it would be modeled after that. And they saw themselves as modeling themselves after Israel, the Israel of the Old Testament, which had this covenantal relation with God. They also focused a lot on education. The Puritans were important in getting the respect for public education here in the United States established. The clergy played an influential role in their society, but not in a directly political way. It was more cultural. It was more part of the society. And then he talks about the Great Awakening in the 1740s. This is stuff we covered early in the semester. There was a development of a distinctively American style of religious and civic interaction. And he gives you a lot of these examples, and he says, what was being played out here was an illustration of this theme of communitas, or community. The disruption of established social structure by new forces creating a new experience of community. So, the conservatives, whenever we use this term conservative, we got to be a little bit careful about what we mean. Do we mean people who just are trying to keep things exactly the same? Do we mean people who are trying to go back to an earlier time? Do we mean people who are trying to create something new, which incorporates features of an earlier time, which were lost in where we currently are, and are being sort of reappropriated in the new present? All of those are things you can tie in with conservatives. In a certain respect, this will sound a little paradoxical. Liberals, at certain points in history, can be the conservatives. Because when they're actually dominant, for example, on abortion, who are the conservatives in the sense that they want to keep it just the same, exactly the way it is? Liberals. They want to keep Roe versus Wade in place and all these other decisions. So these terms are kind of shifting. We have to be careful about what we mean by them. The religious right that he's talking about is doing something that happened way back then with the Great Awakenings, which was to do what I was talking about over here. Let me actually sort of put this on the board, this in kind of a chart form. So you got the past and the present, or the recent past, and then the future. And not too far off. And you've got some sort of structure of society at this point. Society with its norms and culture. And then there's presumably some sort of change. And we have present society and culture. And the way that progressives want to see this is, well, we keep on moving, and it just keeps getting better and better and better. And we just have, newer society and culture. So, think about the theme of civil rights. Well, we start out in America with not too many people having civil rights at all. It's not just, say, women and blacks, Native Americans too, but unless you actually owned land in most of the colonies, you didn't get to vote. And they would lower the amount, and each time that they lowered the amount, there'd be somebody who said, everything's going to go to hell if you do this, But they did it. And then, eventually pretty much everybody who can satisfy certain requirements gets to vote, but there's still some people left out. Then they expand it even more, and it gets expanded even more. Same thing with thinking about protecting people because of their identity. Racism, was an integral part of American culture for a long time. And then we started moving towards a society where it was contested, where they started saying, look, you can't act this way. And it happened all across the board, not just legally. It happened with movies like, what is that one called, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? Ashton Kutcher and Bernie Macri did it. Originally it was Sidney Poitier. Movies like that help to undo racism. Because they show, this black guy coming to dinner, and the basically racist white parents having to come to terms with the fact that he's a person. That produced changes. Are there still things to overcome? This is the progressive way of looking at it. A conservative way of looking at it would be more like this, where you take some of the norms and culture or institutions, and you have an updated version of them. And, in the case of racism, there's not an awful lot of people arguing that we ought to, we need to revive racism. That was a big mistake. But in terms of other things, like the sense of community, or reducing, generational dependency on welfare, things like that, there are people who are saying, look, it was better back in the old days, and obviously we can't just turn the clock back. It needs to be some new form, but that's going to be a radical change from the present. And that's what a lot of conservatives in the last 40 years have been doing. And this is actually what happened during the First Great Awakening as well. So this pattern is pretty old. Your book goes through a bunch of different, interesting examples, but I'm going to skip over a lot of those and just hit on a few particularly important ones. Remember when we talked about the benevolent empire? This interlocking set of institutions, largely expressing evangelical Protestant America. It was carried out through culture, not through legislation. It was an attempt to make America into a Christian nation, not by actually making it, legally required, but by, you might say, overloading every place that was possible. So imagine, with respect to school prayer, some of the ways you can kind of get around it sometimes are having clubs, you could leave the school grounds. Now imagine that the movement started to every place we go, kids are going to just walk off at recess and start praying. If enough of them did something about it, probably they just have to be accepted, because that's typically what we do. That's sort of like what the benevolent empire was doing, and it was also oriented against the other. And who was the other back then? Well, Southern slaveholders. And we're pretty much all agreed that was an other that needed to be an other, and not too many people other than Southern slaveholders were really that upset when their way of life disappeared. But who else? Catholics, non-religious people. Thomas Jefferson was turned into kind of a bad guy, because he's this deist figure. The Mormons, when they come on the scene. And this process continues. Eventually, by the 1920s, though, we see that these forces lose a lot of their ability to get things done. The benevolent empire kind of breaks up, in part because those who were excluded didn't want to be excluded, so they couldn't accept that particular configuration. And in part because there were sort of landmark events. Think about Prohibition. Prohibition was the last thing on which evangelicals could actually get together across the board, along with progressive elements, and get some legislation passed. Pretty much everything else that we can look at has been, small potatoes compared to that. They've never had that sort of power again. Now, throughout the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, it was liberal Protestantism that was dominating. The Catholic Church, of course, is doing its own thing over there, but then they go through their own sort of liberalization with Vatican II. Everything starts changing. The priest actually starts, facing the congregation. They start doing masses in the vernacular. They become more socially engaged. Remember, we talked about the end of the Catholic ghetto. And then the 1960s themselves happened with the sexual revolution and the Vietnam War and the reaction against American civil religion. These are all parts of the story that we've told so far. And what this leads to is the liberals don't win, because the liberals were always these sort of modernizing, bit by bit, make sort of short change reforms, and they could be expressed through all sorts of mainline denomination churches. The conservatives didn't win. The radicals, who were, sort of tear down the system, they come into the scene. A lot of young people leave the mainline churches. They either go to become secular or they become, radicalized in a different way. They become conservative. So your book talks about Jimmy Carter, who now we think of as a very, very left figure, very much, progressive. He was actually seen as sort of a conservative back then. He was an evangelical. He was from the South. He was squeaky clean as opposed to, that dirty Nixon who had really tarnished a lot of stuff. So when he comes in, that's part of the beginning of the story. He wasn't conservative enough, of course, in many respects. He actually became much less conservative as time went on. So much so that he actually became he started doing things that presidents just didn't do, like criticizing sitting presidents in the last presidency before Obama, Bush presidency. There's some key themes that your book focuses on that are worth pointing out with respect to the new religious right. It talks about entrepreneurial evangelical or fundamentalist clergy. And what does that mean to be an entrepreneur? This is kind of a funny thing to say about religion. Any of you want to be entrepreneurs? Well, what is it to be an entrepreneur? It's kind of a fancy term. Comes from French. Yeah.
Like go out and start your own thing.
Exactly, that's it. You instead of joining a corporation and working your way up through the institution, you say, well, hell, I can sell that. I can actually talk to people. I can, satisfy customers. Let me go out and do that. And there was quite a bit of that in religion. There's been a lot of that since the First Great Awakening. George Whitefield was an entrepreneur in that way. And so that's been something that's been central to American religion. He talks about the revival of the Jeremiad sermonic form. And Jeremiad is one of these sort of hell and brimstone sermons of how everything has gone to pot. The nation is going to suffer. Every once in a while there'll be some conservative preacher who will say, well, this thing happened because you let gay marriage occur. It's God's judgment on the nation. That's what they mean by a Jeremiad. An idealization of various eras and aspects of early American culture, including the Founding Fathers. That's this thing again, of going back to the past and saying, we're not going to make everything look like the past, but we want to bring some things that have been lost in the present from the past and put them into a new, modernized form. Proclivity for defining and demonizing enemies. Communists was the enemies for a long time. Secular humanists for a long time. Muslims served that purpose for a lot of people after 9/11, with the war on terror. Polarization of the American population. What does polarization mean? We live in a polarized society right now. Yeah.
It's like both sides are completely at ends and don't want to really work with each other.
Yeah. This has become sort of the status quo for where we are now. It wasn't always like that. It used to be that you could appoint Supreme Court justices without everybody going over their record, with a fine-tooth comb and saying this is going to be the end of the world or this is going to be the best thing possible. People didn't always vote along party lines, but that's become the norm now. It's gotten so bad that dating sites have actually noticed that people on dating sites will look at other people's political affiliations and they'll say, I just won't vote. I won't date a Democrat or I won't date a Republican. That was never the case before. People could, there were some people who'd be kind of a stickler. I wouldn't marry a, dirty whatever. But most people were a bit more, how would you put it, a bit more rational about that sort of thing. A bit less emotional. Social media has kind of contributed to that. This is actually considered to be enough of a problem that I've been to conferences where we're trying to figure out how could we use social media not to create these silos where everybody's talking to each other and posting pro this stuff and anti this stuff in this silo, and how can we get people to actually have real political discourse? Turns out it's really, really difficult. It's tough to do in Facebook. Any of you ever had a bad Facebook argument about politics with one of your friends? or seen one, how irrational people can get. People defriend each other over that, you know? So we're living in a polarized society where both sides tend to demonize the other side. Moral endorsement of the free market goes along with the religious right. Preoccupation with issues of sexual morality, reaffirmation of traditional gender roles, a focus on education as one of the battlegrounds, one of the places where, and they're right, education is a battleground. Because you're talking about what values you're teaching young people who oftentimes don't have a lot of critical awareness and may take that as being the norm, for better or for worse. Promotion of alternatives to public education, all these sorts of things are part of the religious right. Then towards the end, he starts, remember those themes we talked about at the beginning? Like, American exceptionalism or immigration or pluralism, populism. He talks about how each of those ends up being represented in the current situation that we find ourselves. But we're not going to go into all those examples. One of the things that he does sort of stress that I like towards the end is that he says, America's past does offer some resources for hope. Do we have to say, this is not a good situation, we need something radically different? Or do we look at the past, once we actually understand it, and go back and say, maybe we do need to reappropriate this in order to think about, for example, this is one example of many. What's one of the best predictors of the success of children? That comes from family issues. Yeah.
Whether or not the parents were married within the time the children were born.
That's a big one. Then there's things like, do the parents read? Is the father actually there and engaged with the children? That turns out to have huge effects on drug use, school performance, age, where people are becoming sexually active, for boys and for girls in different ways. Now, if you were nobody's saying, well, then obviously the legislation must, keep all the dads there. Don't let the dads become absentee fathers or anything like that. But if you live in a society that stresses personal choice as being the highest thing, which tends to be where liberals or progressives actually are, and says traditional sexual morality, marriage, we can make of that whatever we like. Everybody should be free to do whatever they're going to do. That's not actually able to address that problem. I'm not saying that the conservatives have done a very good job in addressing that problem either. Their divorce rates are just about as high as everybody else's. But there may be resources for looking at how things, not in an idealized way, but in a real historical way, how things used to be. What was successful in the past? Can we actually bring that in new forms into the present? That's what he's suggesting in this book, but not just about, say, fatherhood, but about all sorts of religious themes. Even American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism is this view that somehow the United States is different than other places. That's probably a crazy thing to think in many respects. We're not better than other places in moral terms. We're not particularly well educated in comparison to some other places. We have a greater degree of inequality than most of the other developed countries. But there are some things that are kind of extraordinary about this place. We ought to think about, is there anything to this idea that's still worth holding on to, still worth saving? There are reasons why, even though they may not like, the current, or past political administrations, why people overseas say there's some really great things about America, why they want to emigrate here. That's something that's worth rethinking, this notion of American exceptionalism. And there's all sorts of ideas like that we've covered this semester that we could apply this same thing to. That's where he ends. He says, the American tradition does offer resources for addressing the propensities of Americans to see themselves as this, central nation, the central people. And then he talks about Lincoln, who noted that in the second inaugural address that doesn't, that's not an easy thing to sound out. You can't figure out exactly what God's plans are or what God wants for you. He's talking about the Civil War and how both sides, pray to the same God, use the same Bible, and we're also claiming destiny for themselves. So that's something worth keeping in mind as we close the semester, as we look at religious conservatives, but also religious liberals, because they all do have a tendency to read the divine plan into their own political agendas.